Okay, good afternoon. Welcome. All right, so let's get started. We're going to do two things today. Good chance that we may sort of wind things up a little early, but no worries about that. If it happens, it happens. Okay. So sorry, I've taught this lesson 4 times today, and I completely blanked on what I'm asking you to do. Okay, here's what we're doing. 2 things. We're going to do a couple of conveyance exercises to make sure that we sort of have a grip on how that process works, and a couple of additional wrinkles that are related to it. And then we are going to, there's a survey that I have done, that I've made up for you guys, where I'm basically asking you to check in on how the class is going and how you feel and sort of where we're going with that. Yeah, that's what we're going to do today. So let me put the first conveyance into the chat for us to talk about. 2A for life, then 2A's heirs. Okay, so the first step in the process is to figure out what the conveyance says it's creating. Okay, what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be talking about rules that complicate things so that you can't necessarily trust what the conveyance says. But the first step is always to figure out what the conveyance says. So, who owns the present interest after this conveyance, and what do they own? Who owns the present interest, and what do they own? Okay, no, that's not an awful answer. Like that's a perfectly reasonable answer. I'm saying after this conveyance goes into effect, who owns the present interest and what do they own? Right?
They owns the present interest and he owns a life estate.
Right, right. And I'm seeing a couple of folks saying the correct thing, that A owns a life estate. A couple of folks saying that A owns fee simple. Remember that fee simple is inheritable, and so if the conveyance is only valid for life, it can't be inherited, right? So, okay. So let me put the conveyance back in the chat. Okay, so 2A for life. It creates a life estate in A. Life estates have to have future interests. So what the way to describe a future interest, I'm going to put this in the chat, is that a future interest to the holder in the possessory interest. Okay, so whenever you're describing a future interest, you have to describe what future interest is created, who holds it, and then when that future interest vests, what possessory interest is created, right? That's the full description of a future interest. So A holds the life estate. What future interest is created when a life estate comes into existence? Right, a remainder. Who holds the remainder? Again, we're just asking what the conveyance says, okay? Right, A's heirs. And what possessory interest do they get when, yes, exactly. Okay, so if I were to ask you to describe the conveyances that the interests that this conveyance purports to create, you would say a life estate to A and a remainder to A's heirs in fee simple absolute. Okay? Here's the wrinkle. Who are A's heirs? Who are A's heirs? Nope. I just says descendants. Nope. Right. A's heirs don't exist because he's still alive. Prior to his death, who holds the interests of his heirs or their heirs? Who holds the interests? Who holds the interests of A's heirs prior to his death? Why would the grantor hold A's heirs' interests? What does the grantor have to do with A's heirs? Right. A holds the interest of his heirs prior to his death, because here's the thing, right? So we talk about heirs as if they're the children of the person, but that's not who they have to be, right? It's entirely possible that the heir is the spouse or the parents, God forbid, right? Or siblings, or, just a random guy that A met at a bar who made him laugh. And he's like, my kids are all, jerks. And this guy's funny, so I'm going to leave him my fortune, right? We've all heard that. Well, maybe you guys haven't heard that country song. The heirs only have an interest as defined by A, which means that it is not unreasonable to write the interests created by this conveyance like this. Right? Life estate to A, remainder to A in fee simple. Now, that's nonsense because A can't hold anything after he dies, and his life estate by definition doesn't terminate until he dies. But it's the same concept as saying that his heirs hold the remainder. Do we make sense so far? Is the explanation so far making sense? Great. Okay. In some jurisdictions, this conveyance creates fee simple absolute in A. This is a rule that we call the rule in Shelley's case. Don't ask me who Shelley is. I don't know. Just the person who was relevant for the case. Okay. Shelley's case says that where you have a freehold estate, right, which is an estate that does not terminate at a particular time, but terminates when an event happens. Okay, so you have a freehold estate with the remainder, with the future interest held by the heirs of the holder of the freehold estate. Okay, so let me put that in the chat for you. Okay, so freehold estate So it's a freehold estate with the future interest held by the holder's heirs. Okay. Under this condition, the rule in Shelley's case merges the present interest and the future interest. And so they become one thing, they become fee simple absolute held by the holder. Okay. Not every jurisdiction follows this. Okay, some jurisdictions will say that 2A for life, then to A's heirs creates a life estate and a remainder. Okay, and you will just have to look up which jurisdiction, what kind of jurisdiction you're in. Okay, so do we understand the merger doctrine that we're using here? Does this make sense? Sure. Okay. So you have a present interest held by some person. Okay. You have the future interest that is created by that present interest held by that person's heirs. Okay. In Shelley's case jurisdictions, those two things are combined and they become fee simple absolute. Because remember, right? So the present interest, right? The present interest is everything from the date of the conveyance to the terminating condition. And then the remainder interest, the future interest, is from the terminating condition until the end of time. Okay? And because of the specific circumstance that the holder's heirs hold the future interest, the rule in Shelley's case is that these become one estate. Is that better, Tiani? Does it make more sense? Great. You would tell me if you were still confused, right? I hope. Okay, so if everybody understands this one, then let's go on to the next one. Are we good? Going once? Going twice? Okay, moving on to the next conveyance. Okay, so here is the conveyance. So again, following the same process. Who owns the present interest and what do they own? Okay, A owns the present interest in the form of fee simple determinable. Why do you say that? Okay, so how, I mean, you're reading the conveyance correctly, but why is it that that condition makes it a fee simple determinable? Right, exactly. Okay, exactly. So we know that the present interest is a fee simple determinable to A. Now, fee simple determinable necessarily creates a future interest. So what future interest is created? Let me put the conveyance back into the chat. So fee simple determinable to A, what future interest is created? Okay, why do you say a possibility of reverter? Exactly right. Exactly right. Okay, great. So who owns the possibility of reverter? Yes, B. Okay. What possessory interest is created when the possibility of reverter vests? Okay, why do you say that? Sure. The question is, we know that B holds a possibility of reverter. What possessory interest is created when that possibility of reverter vests? So Chemica says it's a fee simple determinable. Why do you say that? Yeah, okay, sure. Kimika, how would you write that condition to convert it to a fee simple subject to a condition subsequent? So you're correct that B has a possibility of reverter in fee simple determinable. I'm asking you, how would you write the conveyance to B so that instead of creating a fee simple determinable, it created a fee simple subject to condition subsequent? Well, what's the condition in Kimika's? What is the condition that ceases to be in Kimika's conveyance? Singleness, right. So do we think that Kimika's conveyance does a better job of being a condition subsequent, or do we think that IJA's does? Let me know if I mispronounced your name, by the way, because I want to make sure I get it right. Well, it matters to me because it's your name and I want to get it right. So who do we think has the better conveyance? Do we think that the better conveyance is to be if, but if she marries? Or do we think that the better conveyance is to be until she ceases to be single? Let me rephrase that. I'm not asking for which one do you think is like more aesthetically pleasing. I'm asking which one do you think does a better job of creating a condition subsequent? Alana says the latter. I'm inclined to agree. Okay. Okay. So this is what we have so far. Okay. And now the conveyance again. So if B has a fee simple determinable, there must be a future interest. What future interest is being created? Well, do we think that a remainder is the future interest that's being created? Because what makes a remainder different from a possibility of reverter? heirs only matter once an interest becomes possessory. So Halana is correct, right? The difference between the remainder and the possibility of reverter is the type of estate that's originally granted. And the reason it matters is that remainders are certain to vest. There's no world in which a remainder fails to vest. Okay. There are circumstances where remainders don't come into existence. So some of you may, as you're reading out in the world trying to learn this, you may hear about contingent remainders and you may think, hey, that sounds like a remainder that may not vest. No, it may not come into existence. A contingent remainder is a remainder that requires something else to happen for it to come into existence. So let me give you an example of what I mean by this. Okay, so So 2A until B reaches the age of majority, then to B for life, then to C and their heirs. So C has a contingent remainder, okay? Because if B dies at the age of 12, then B never receives the estate and C's remainder never comes into existence. A holds simply, and A just receives a fee simple at that point, and everything after that goes away. Okay, so I don't want you guys to get confused, and this has been a bit of a detour, but I wanted to make sure that we understood it, right? Contingent remainders exist, but there's not a question of whether the remainder vests. A possibility of reverter is a future interest that may never vest. Okay, so do we understand the difference now? Do we understand the difference now? Awesome. Okay, so putting the conveyance back in. Okay, so what future interest does B's fee simple determinable create? And remainder was not a bad guess, right? I'm not gonna name names, but one of your classmates earlier today at some point suggested a fee tail was a future interest, and no, it's not. So at least you guys named an actual future interest, right? So yes, possibility of reverter for the same reason that that's what B has. Okay, so who has this possibility of reverter when B's fee simple determines? Who owns the possibility of reverter? Right? Because that's what it says. Okay, and what possessory interest does C's possibility of reverter provide then? So when that possibility of reverter vests, what does C have? Why do you say fee simple absolute? Okay, so I think you're on the right track, Kimiko, but there's no such thing as a fee simple absolute subject to a condition subsequent. Okay, fee simple can be absolute or it can be subject to a condition subsequent. Yes, that's correct. Okay, why is it a fee simple subject to a condition subsequent?
Sorry, sir. Could you just repeat the last part one more time?
Sure. Why is it a fee simple subject to a condition subsequent?
Is it because C has to not marry a Montague? Wait.
That's the condition. You've correctly identified the condition, right? Why is it a condition subsequent and not a determinable? Because there's a condition attached that if breached terminates the interest. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, it's the cessation of a state of affairs, right? It's you know, at the point where C marries you know, Juliet Montague, then they will no longer have never married a Montague. And so here endeth the condition, and yeah, but that's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. Okay. So now here is what we have. Okay, fee simple determinable to A, possibility of reverter to B in fee simple determinable, a conditional possibility of reverter to C in fee simple subject to condition subsequent. Why is C's possibility of reverter conditional? Because B may never get possession of the property, right? A's determining condition is that they become a lawyer. If they live their whole life and never become a lawyer and then they die, well, then the possibility of reverter never vests and A's heirs take, and they now hold in fee simple absolute. Okay, so C has a conditional possibility of reverter because until B takes, C has nothing. Okay, does that make sense? All right. C's possessory interest in the event that it gets to them is a fee simple subject to condition subsequent, which means that there must be a future interest. What future interest is created? Let me put the conveyance back in the chat. So what future interest is created? Why a reversion? Why a reversion? I'm thinking. Because you're right that the holder of this future interest is the original grantor. I thought through this earlier today and I didn't like reversion. I'm trying to remember why. Oh, I remember why. It's because reversions vest automatically. And the one thing that makes the fee simple condition subsequent different from all the other defeasible present interests is that the future interest it creates does not automatically vest. So you're absolutely right that the original grantor is the holder of the future interest. I would not characterize it as a reversion because it's a fee simple subject to condition subsequent. Okay. And also, if we're being very honest, reversions are also certain to vest. And the key piece of all of these present interests is that they may never be divested. The condition may never trigger. So I would call this a right of reentry. I think you're absolutely right that the original grantor holds it. What possessory interest is conveyed by this right of reentry? What possessory interest is conveyed by the right of reentry? Exactly right. Okay, so you remember on Thursday I talked about how a lot of times when you're writing interests that a conveyance creates, there's a shadow future interest back to the original grantor because they never conveyed fee simple absolute. And so at some point, after all the determinable and defeasible interests pass away, the original grantor steps back in and holds in fee simple absolute. And that's exactly what happens here, right? We have all these things that have conditions attached and divestment opportunities, and when they all blow up, the original grantor has to be there to pick up the pieces because they never conveyed fee simple absolute. So the whole set of interests that the conveyance claims to create, right? It helps if I use the right keyboard. So fee simple determinable to A, power of reverter to, or possibility of reverter to B in fee simple determinable, conditional possibility of reverter to C in fee simple condition subsequent, and a right of reentry to the original grantor in fee simple absolute. This is the second time I've done this. The right of reentry is technically conditional because if any of these conditions fail to happen, then the grantor who does not meet their condition just takes in fee simple absolute, and then the right of reentry disappears. Okay. Here is the wrinkle. Here is the wrinkle. We don't like restraints on marriage. in property law. We think you should be able to marry who you want, and that it's wrong for people to use property to leverage you into marrying or not marrying. So complete restraints on marriage will be void. Complete restraints on marriage will be void. And remember, we went through this a little earlier today. When there is a void condition attached to a conveyance, the void condition disappears, and everything that depends on the void condition disappears. So this conveyance, right, because of the void restraint on marriage, would actually create these interests. Fee simple determinable to A, possibility of reverter to B in fee simple absolute. And nothing after that matters, because there's now a fee simple absolute. Okay? Here's the other wrinkle. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that B has a valid condition, okay, attached to their holding, and so it triggers. Partial restraints on marriage, absolutely valid. So you can say to your child, you know, I don't want you to get married before you're 25, because I don't think you're mature enough to do it. And if you get married before you're 25, I'm going to take away this piece of property that I'm giving you. You're allowed to say, I don't want you to marry that worthless jerk you're dating now. I want you to marry someone better. And so if you marry, you know, worthless jerkathon, I'm taking away the piece of property that I'm giving you. You know, you can say, I don't want you to marry anybody from this family that I really hate. And so you can't marry any Capulets or Montagues. You can marry someone else, but you can't marry them. And these are all valid restraints. So the restraint on C is valid. The restraint on B is void. Okay, so just so we're clear, right? Let me put this in the chat. Okay, the complete restraint on marriage is void. The partial restraint on marriage is valid. Okay. There's one more that I'm going to give you, but we're not going to discuss it. We're not going to do the whole process. I'm just going to jump straight to the wrinkle because we're short on time. To A and their heirs, so long as A never joins the Catholic Church. Okay, so this creates a defeasible fee. I think that there is a reasonable reading. I intended it for it to be condition subsequent. Having now gone through this 4 times, I am not unconvinced. You know, I think that it being determinable is not an unreasonable reading. Either way, the result is the same. Okay. A takes in fee simple absolute, and here's why. We don't like telling people who they can and can't marry through property law. We really don't like telling people how they can and can't worship through property law. It is regarded as wildly immoral to use property to pressure someone on a matter of conscience. And so restraints on faith are void. Okay? Do we understand this? Restraints on faith are void. Questions?
Sorry, I understand what you're saying completely about the faith, but if it's based on a moral principle, do other things that affect morality become voidable as well?
There is no authority to suggest that they are void. They're not voidable, they're void. Like this is not, this condition does not exist. It's not we can set it aside. It doesn't exist. You know, maybe we will see that sort of develop over the next couple of decades as religious bases for decision making, you know, may or may not become less salient. But right now, no, that's not the other moral principles other than faith, not going to be mechanisms that will void a condition. Okay. All right. Last thing for today. Let me pull this up and show you what I want from you. Okay. Go. Okay, so you are going to go onto the course website. You're going to scroll down to the calendar block with this week in it. You're going to click on the midterm course evaluation. This is just a short survey, just 8 questions where I'm asking you to talk to me about what's working and what's not working in this class, because I want to do more of the things that are working and the things that are helping you, and I want to do less of the things that aren't. So that's the plan. Okay. And yeah, that's everything. And so I will see you guys tomorrow in the lecture. So take care.